People these days seem to think need technology to get the upper hand.
Alright, so here we are in my finish room. There's a couple different ways to proceed into the next process, and I'm going to show you some different methods here. So this is my preferred way of making arrows. I like to put sealer on over the stain before I crown dip. With this product line, you can do both. You can actually crown dip right to the bare shaft. I prefer to put the sealer on first so that I can knock down all the raised grain off of there and come out with a nice smooth shaft before I crown dip and crest. But what we're going to do is I'm going to build them both ways. So this is the brown mahogany stain that I put on the shaft. I'm going to dip these in a clear gloss first. Let's talk a little bit about the sealers. I stock them in the quart can. They're available on the website. All the long dip tubes, all these dip tubes right here the big ones hold 1.75 pints. On these dip tubes, you'll see where the dip tube has a little line here that's right below the lid. When the lid gets screwed on, that's your reservoir. I will dip until it gets down towards the bottom, and then I'll use a cone filter to put it on there and refill my tube so that I make sure that there's no contaminants on the lid, or when I remove the lid, that there's no contaminants in here that's going to contaminate my tube. So my tube, I try to keep those as clean as we can, because if not, if you get something on there and it gets on the shaft, you're going to get some bumps in there. So little paper filters help with that. Clear finishes, they seem to have some sort of solid in them, or after a while they'll settle and you'll notice a variation in the color. So before I put them in the tube, I'll shake the bottle up. This is going to make air bubbles. You need to let it sit in the tube for a while, let all those air bubbles go away before you start dipping. Also, if you have sealer in your tube, you need to mix it up in there. If you don't mix it, you'll get like a texture. It's not quite like a fisheye, but I noticed that there's a texture on the arrows if I don't mix the tube up. So I found a good use for my old carbon shafts and arrows. They make great mixing sticks. So what you're going to do is I stick the shaft in there and then just run it up and down in there in the dip tube, mixing any of the solids that are on the bottom of the dip tube. It'll bring them up, and you're just trying to circulate everything in there. One thing I found with this product line is once you think you've mixed it enough, mix it some more. I honestly will run this thing down 20 to 25 times to get a good mix. You'll see my little setup here. I have this little hook. I let all the extra run back off into the dip tube. Now you'll notice I have a little funnel in there. What it is just the top of a Gatorade bottle. I stick that in there because the way I got this set up, I can dip 3 arrows at the same time and it'll funnel all the stuff back in there, and I keep from making a mess. If you look at my arrow rack here too, I got this I got this idea from Joe there at True North. It's just a piece of plywood with a bunch of coffee cup hooks that I have on there. This is a clothespin for delicate clothes with a little rubber gripper on the inside. It seems to hold on to a tapered shaft if I have the point taper on the wood arrow real well to where it doesn't fall out. So what I'll do with these arrows is just dip them all the way in. I dip them just past the back end of the bevel so that these arrows will be coated all the way with 8 coats of sealer from tip to tail. The whole thing will be coated up, so there's no way to get any water penetration into your shaft once you got it sealed up. We're going to dip these real quick. And then I set them up here to dry, and I will, on this step, the longer you wait, the harder this cures. And the better off you are, especially on the first dip. So I'm going to dip these and let them hang overnight. And then from there, we'll move on to the next step, which is sanding them down. Okay, we'll talk about the True North line of crown dipping paint. It comes in a variety of colors. The most popular color for me, or the one I use the most, is the white, because white is a good base for everything. These paints have solids in them. They will settle down, so before I pour them into the dip tube, I, again, just like the sealers, shake them up really good. This is going to induce a bunch of air bubbles into this again. You're going to have to pour it into your tube and let it set overnight. You don't want any air bubbles on there, because if they stick onto your shaft, it's going to give you a fisheye look. I've got a tube here. I use the small dip tubes made by Archery Pass now. They the small dip tubes holds 1.25 pints. So one of those will fill it up almost all the way. You can get quite a few arrows out of this before you need to refill it. Okay, now for the green arrows. With the True North line, you can dip paint right to the raw shaft wood, and so that's what we're going to do with these. Some of the colors, I recommend that you dip them in white first, because it'll give it more brilliance. So the lime green, the yellows, the pinks, some of the lighter shades, tangerine, I like the way they look with a dip of white underneath as a primer coat. Not that they need the primer to stick to the wood, but it just gives you a better color at the end when you're done. So we're going to do this both ways. I am going to dip yellow straight onto 6, and then I'm going to dip 6 of them in white, and then we'll dip over that with yellow and see if we can see the difference. So again, I'm just going to use an old carbon arrow here for mixing. You can see the different shape that it has here in the bottom is from the silicone plug that's on the end of the shaft, but there's quite a bit of buildup on it as I use it for different colors. You can tell this was last done for the OD green and then the tangerine and the white. So I use these mixing sticks all the time, so if you have an old shaft, keep that around for this purpose. Okay, so these are our green stained arrow shafts. Nothing looks better with green than yellow. I'm a lifelong Oregon Duck fan, so that's the color scheme I'm going to put on these. Now remember, I did 2 lines on this. I'm going to leave the center natural so you can see the natural look of the Sitka spruce when I'm in there. So I'm only going to dip up to this line so there'll be a gap. To speed up time, I'll usually take 2 arrows, I'll hold them together. When you dip 2 arrows together, the paint's going to stick in between, which is fine when it's wet. You just don't want to let them dry that way. So I'll dip in the paint, let the paint run down, then I'll separate the arrows and hang them up. The other thing I recommend you do is when you're dipping, when you pull your arrow out and you go across, you'll inevitably get some paint on the upper edge of your dip tube. It's a good idea to always clean that off. Because I've done it a couple times where I get in a hurry and I just put the lid back on. Well, eventually that will dry up against this lid, which makes it just a little bit more difficult to open. But more importantly, when you crack it and you pull it off, sometimes those flakes that are dry will fall back into your paint. Then you go and dip and that'll stick into the paint and it contaminates your crown dip. You'll have a paint flake in there and they're hard to crest over and they just don't look good. So before I put the lid back on, I always clean that rim off real quick with a paper towel, and it keeps me from contaminating the rest of the tube. Alright, well these are all nice and dry. I've had to work the last couple days, so they've had about 72 hours to cure, so they normally don't need that long, but they're nice and cured up hard. Okay, so the next step, just like before with the dailies or basically any finish you're going to do, this is going to raise the grain on the shaft. So we had them sanded smooth before, we stained them, we put them in their first round of sealer for these brown ones, and if you run your hand over them, they're rough again. So the little fibers that were on the outside of the wood have stood up because we got them wet. And so they're out there. So we need to sand them down, knock them down. The last time we used steel wool, so when they're using dailies, it's oil-based, you can get away with that. And if you break little bits of that, they usually come off in the with the air compressor or if you wipe them down with a rag. The difference being now we're using a water base, so if we do that, they'll rust, and you'll get little rust marks in your arrows. Doesn't look good. So when we're using this water-based products, you want to use a 3M pad. Now this is what you're typically going to find in a hardware store, or if you go to your local home improvement. These are also very similar to what's on the back of a sponge, which is another thing you can use. So these little scrubber pads, while they're not as effective, will work if that's all you have to work with. They will also work for the stain. I forgot to mention that in the other episode. So if you can't find a foam handled brush like this, you can use this if you can get these for washing dishes or cleaning up. Because of this 90-degree angle on there, you can cut a line on your shaft by using this and spreading your stain. So that's just another option. When they're new, this back scrubber side will work for knocking down the arrows. It's just they're not as high a quality of a scrubber. So you won't get to smooth out as many arrows as you would with using this stuff. So this is just a 3M Scotch Brite pad. You can find it at your local home improvement store. Work pretty good. You can see that they will take some of the finish off. And really that's what you're doing. What we're doing is we're scrubbing or sanding basically the shaft down so that it's smooth again. And if you rub your hand down on there, you'll feel it. Now, these do a pretty good job, but you have to rub on them quite a bit in order to get that to come down. I actually prefer the automotive line that they have. I buy them by the case on here. This is actually for primer and auto body work when you're working on the paint to prime it out and smooth it out. So you can feel it. It's a rougher bite. So on the after the first dip, the shafts are rougher. This is what I use on the initial knockdown. It doesn't take as many strokes or as much work to get the raised grains and fibers all knocked down. So basically just kind of go across the entire shaft and it's nice and smooth again. Now this arrow, once it is blown off or wiped off with a microfiber cloth, is ready to dip again. We got these all sanded down with the 3M pad. Like I said, I like the maroon ones. A little bit more aggressive. They're nice and smooth again. And they're ready for their second coat. Now you notice I just with that one arrow that I did in here as I was kind of showing you what I was going to do, it left dust all over this. So again, I recommend that you get your arrows out of where you're finishing them, go outside, sand them down, and then I use compressed air to blow them off. You can also use a microfiber cloth to clean them off because you don't want that dust staying on your shafts, because when you go to dip it in there eventually all that stuff will come off in your finish and it just ends up contaminating your tube and you won't get that nice smooth feel. Now the arrows that were painted, the paint on a raw wood shaft raises the grain way more than the stain. So I did not sand down the stain. I only sanded down the paint side and get them till they're smooth again. And we're going to give them a second coat of paint. Now I figured out I screwed up on these white ones when I was dipping them. I went past my line on some of them. You can see where they're not even. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put another line here, and when we dip over them again, I'm going to dip down to that line. And we'll see what it looks like. If not, I can fix it while I'm crusting off. Alright, so anytime I do a crown dip, I like using 2 coats on there, because with just 1 coat you can still see some of the grain coming through, and that double coat gives it that nice finished look. So with that, I'm going to coat these again in yellow. Okay, so now we're going to let them dry, probably overnight because it's getting late and first day after daylight savings time, so I'm probably going to call it early today, but we'll let them dry overnight and we'll pick it up tomorrow. Okay, so our arrows each have 4 coats of sealer on them. The ones with the green stain are already crown dipped. They're nice and smooth. These are ready for crusting. But before we get to that point, I'd like to weigh them all across the dozen to make sure I don't have one arrow out of the dozen that's picking up more weight faster than the others. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to weigh them all, write them down. As long as they're all still within 10 grains and picking up equally, we'll move on to the next step. If not, this is the time where I can correct some of that by putting on an extra dip of sealer on there. The True North sealer is thin enough, it doesn't affect any spine. All it'll do is add a little bit of weight to the shaft. So it looks like a couple of the green and yellow ones. I'm going to dip again just to bring them in. They're within 12 grains right now of a dozen, but it's only like 3 or 4 that are on the low side. So if I dip those again one more time, it'll bring them in closer. And hopefully by the time we're all done, they'll be well within 10 grains of each other across the dozen. Because the natural with the brown stain are actually all within 6 grains of each other right now. So they're ready to continue on with the next step, which is going to be to crown dip them. The one thing I will do, because they've got the 4 coats of gloss, they're really nice and smooth right now. I will take a green 3M pad, like you see here, and one that's been used a little bit so it's not super aggressive. And I will just scuff the part that I'm going to crown dip. What this will do is it gives the finish just a little bit of teeth, if you will, so that the crown dip will have something to hold on to. Not that I've ever had it to come off, but the more you prep and get the surface ready, I think the better off you are getting a more durable finish in the end. So I have just lightly scuffed it like you saw me do, just a little bit past where the stain is, because remember you're going to have a little bit of cresting paint there, and that'll also give something for the cresting paint to hold on to.
Grandpa taught me long ago how to listen to the land. Taught me to always feel the wind, walk just like the leaves, and trust my mind and my hand can provide all that I need. This is Lombard country, it's been for many years. And I'll hunt just like the men who walk the trail of tears. Yes, I will. This is Lombard country, and I'm glad to say still a few of us left. Wouldn't do it any other way. My bow is made of hickory, backed with the tendon of the elm.